Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Carl Larsen from RMCG, and today's webinar, Integrated Pest Management, a more sustainable approach, and our focus is on vegetable crops this afternoon. So we've got 1 hour, and our commitment to you is to stay under that time. So hopefully you've had a chance to grab a bit of lunch and jump in front of the computer or join via phone. We've got over 80 people that have registered for the session today, which is fantastic, and it's going to be really, really good. We've got some great guest speakers lined up for you today, and before I do introduce them, just a quick overview of the session and also who's facilitating and bringing it to you today. So it's been organised under the National Vegetable Extension Network, or VegNET, as you might have known or heard about. And essentially what VegNET is getting research that's been levy funded out onto vegetable growing farms around the country. So there's 10 projects in each of the main growing regions around the country. And RMCG delivers the Victorian and also the Tassie whole of state projects as well. But you'll see wherever you are in terms of a grower advisor or someone else involved in the industry, you've got an industry development officer or field officer not too far away from you, and hopefully you've had some interaction with them or some of the events and communications that are delivered through the project. And that one's funded through Hort Innovation. So today we're joined by Angelica Cameron from IPM Technologies, who's going to kick us off very shortly on the researcher perspective and talk to us about really what is IPM, where to start and what is it, before moving on to Nigel Dolinek from EE Muir and Son, who's going to be giving us, I guess, the agronomist perspective and some of his recent experiences in an advisor training session and what that's meant for the growers that he's servicing over in South Australia. And also we've got I'm really lucky to be joined by Adam Schreurs of Schreurs and Sons to give us the grower perspective. So today we've got Victoria and South Australia pretty well represented, but I know quite a few people joining us from WA, Queensland, New South Wales, and a couple of international visitors too. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we do get stuck into the session. If this is the first webinar that you've joined on GoTo, you'll see you've got a control panel up on your screen there along with us, which just enables you to see firstly who else is on the line. But the most important thing I wanted to just draw your attention to is there's a questions or chat function where you can type in a question or a comment as we go. They come directly through to me and I can put those to our presenters as we go through and just make it a bit more interactive and two-way. And we'll do our best to try and get to all of those questions in the 1 hour that we've got. Just to let us know who's on the line, it is a bit different if you're used to the workshop environment or the chat in the field or the packing shed. We can't actually see you, we can see the presenters. So just to give us a bit more of an idea of who is on the line, you'll see up on the screen now, there's just a quick poll that's come up asking how much experience you've got with IPM in veggie crops. So if you could click one of the 4 options there, lots, a bit, not much, or none, keen to know more. That just gives us an idea of who we've got on the line and perhaps how to pitch some of the messaging. So we've got about 3/4 of us voted so far. We'll get those coming in. And the majority have voted now, so I'll just close that and share back with you the results. So we've got a pretty even spread. The largest cohort there with a bit around 50%, but we've got a few people with lots and some with not much, and also, yeah, minority with none, keen to know more. So look, thanks very much for filling that out. That just gives us an idea, as I said, where everyone's up to, because we can't gauge that direct because we're not face to face. So Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Angelica now. So Angelica, I'll pass over the keyboard and mouse to you so we can bring up your presentation. That should be coming up on your screen now, hopefully.
Yep. Just let me know if that's come through for you guys.
Yeah, we can see that at our end. Thanks.
Beautiful. Okay. So I'm going to try to give you about the briefest introduction to IPM and how to get started that I've ever had to give outside of a quick chat in a paddock. So I'll try and mimic that scenario. I'll just let you know firstly a little bit about who I am and the team that I work with. So I'm an entomologist and I work with Paul Horn and Jessica Page and Janet Horn. We're a very small company called IPM Technologies based down here in Victoria. And the company's been operating for over 20 years and I joined them about 5 years ago. We support growers and advisors to adopt IPM, so basically helping people make this transition step from whatever they've been doing, typically relying on routine spray applications, into taking on an IPM approach. So that involves doing a lot of training, and we also need to do some IPM research to be able to be in a position to give that advice. We're independent from the biological control industry, the companies like Bugs for Bugs or biological services that supply predatory insects and mites and parasites for pests to growers. And we have experience in a very wide range of crops, so you'll get a sense of that as I run through. But things like broadacre crops, wheat, barley, canola down here, down south and in New Zealand as well. Lots of work in vegetable crops over the years, including work at the moment in South Australia with people like Nigel, who's in the picture up in the next to me in the top left corner there. You'll be hearing from him a little bit more about that. We also work in tree and vine crops, and then in some of these intensive protected cropping systems. And the IPM approach, it's not a recipe for any of these crops, it's an approach, and we apply it in each of these situations very successfully. Probably one of the biggest differences is that in indoor crop environments where IPM is practiced all over the world highly successfully, the approach relies mainly on introducing biological control agents and using them very much instead of sprays with minimal sprays alongside them. Whereas in an outdoor environment, like many of these outdoor vegetable crops or broadacre crops, we rely predominantly on good bugs that turn up naturally, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So how can we control pests? What are our options? Essentially, we think you can fit anything you might do to control pests into one of these three categories: biological, cultural or chemical controls. Biological controls are the predators, parasites, pathogens of pests. I could call them the natural enemies or beneficial agents. The cultural controls are just management techniques. These are all the different things that you do on farm as a manager. You may do them for other reasons, so it might be the way you run your irrigation, the way you manage your soil, your crop rotation, things like that. But all of these things have an impact on populations of pests and beneficials, and they come under the category of cultural control. Other things like variety selection also fit in there. And then, of course, the familiar option down the bottom there is chemicals or sprays. So we've got all of these options. What's integrated pest management? Essentially, it's just using all of those three tools together in a compatible way. So putting together a strategy where biological and cultural controls are the primary control options, and chemicals are used as a support tool. And to do this, the decisions need to be made based on monitoring. So someone's got to get out there and have a look at the crop to see what's going on and make that decision about whether or not a spray might be needed, whether biological control agents or the cultural management practices are actually doing the job you expected. When we talk about biological control agents, these predators, parasites or pathogens of pests, are sort of two complementary strategies, and they both can be applied in outdoor crops, and then in indoor protected cropping situations it's very much the second strategy. The first is simply to preserve, attract and encourage the naturally occurring beneficials, and this is often underestimated in outdoor crops, the value of these naturally occurring biocontrol agents. And then on top of that, we can also release commercially produced beneficials. IPM doesn't necessarily mean buying in and releasing bugs. It can do, but it's not always necessary, and in many cases we simply don't need to do that at all. Who are these biological control agents? This isn't an entomology course, and I'm only going to flash up a few pictures here just to show you, but we're talking about things like hoverflies. So the adults aren't predatory, but the larval stage is a little maggot that feeds on things like aphids or whiteflies, a range of different pests. That's the picture that you've got over here on the left. We also have lacewings, green lacewings, brown lacewings, lots of different species that occur in different environments and prey on a wide range of pests, from aphids through to caterpillars and lots of sucking insects like mealybugs and psyllids and scale insects. These are some of the key predatory species that occur naturally in outdoor crops. Other things like ladybirds. So you've got a ladybird beetle that you might recognise there, the red thing with the black stripes, and then you've got next to it the larval stage, which lots of people don't recognise, and we spend time out in crops showing people these things. Or the predatory bug up in the right corner there is a damsel bug, and another species of ladybird down the bottom, the tiny black dot, is another ladybird that feeds specifically on mites. So these are just a couple of examples of the sorts of predators we're talking about. When it comes to parasites or pests, we're talking typically about wasps and flies that live for part of their life cycle inside the body of the pest and then take over and kill it. And so you've got a picture of my finger there with a caterpillar. It's a diamondback moth caterpillar out of a brassica crop. And I pulled it apart, and you can see inside there's a little bright green maggot. That's the larval stage of a wasp that's parasitized that caterpillar. You can see the adult wasp in the top right corner. And then there's some strange looking aphids down the bottom there. Many of you might be familiar with these. You may not have known that these are no longer healthy aphids. These are actually the cocoons of wasps that have done a similar trick, taking over the body of the aphid, turning it into its own cocoon and killing the aphid in the process. So these are the sorts of things that are out there naturally in crops, and some of these species are also available to purchase and release in either outdoor crops or protected crops, where they may never get there if you don't put them in yourself. Some examples of cultural controls. These are very powerful tools, but they're often overlooked, and quite a lot of the work we do involves highlighting the importance of cultural controls and helping people come up with cultural control options that can support biological control in various crop environments. Some of the basic ones are things like providing a habitat or an alternative food source for beneficials. So this might be something like ensuring that there are some flowering plants, providing a nectar or pollen source to boost populations of predatory mites, or populations of little wasps that parasitize pests, or the adult stages of ladybirds, lacewings and hoverflies. And other examples are things like sequential planting. I'll describe that one in a moment. Things like quarantine and hygiene, variety selection, weed management, soil management. These are all the sorts of cultural control options that what's practical on one farm might not be practical on another, and so these things we work out sites, on a site-specific basis. So just to illustrate some of those cultural control options, the top left picture there just shows a brassica crop with a planting of a mix of flowering plants in a strip down the side of the crop, and that was used to attract and encourage adult stages of predatory insects and the adult stages of wasp parasitoids of pests to come and improve their activity in this crop, which otherwise doesn't really have a flower in it because they're good at managing weeds. Next to it, you've got a picture of some capeweed and some marshmallow. So these are important weeds to manage if you have problems with pests like red-legged earth mite or vegetable weevil, more relevant down in the southern parts of Australia than up north, obviously. But just an example of how weed management can have a big impact on certain pest species if they use those particular weed hosts to get going. Then there's some cucumbers there. This is a glasshouse example. So there's a bit of basil hanging around just below the cucumbers, and this is an example of using the basil plant as a habitat site for a particular predatory bug that they introduce into the cucumbers, a predatory bug called Aureus, a pirate bug that feeds on thrips. And thrips are a major pest in these cucumbers. So having that basil there to boost the population of this predatory bug, make sure that the ones that are introduced are actually going to survive and thrive and breed in the crop, is an important cultural control in that crop environment. The last example down there, the bottom right, is just showing how sequential plantings across a large landscape can have an impact on pest and beneficial populations. So if you imagine that you're spraying broad spectrum insecticides and you don't have any good bugs in the crop, but a few pests get through, as you go across a paddock and keep planting in sequence, the only things that move across into the youngest plantings are going to be pests. But if you have an IPM crop where you have a nice thriving balance with a low pest population and plenty of beneficial insects active in the crop, then you're actually going to benefit from having a sequence of plantings across the paddock. The first planting will get hardest hit because the pests will arrive first. As beneficials then arrive and begin to establish and aren't killed by the use of broad spectrum insecticides, you get a nice balance working, and sequential as you go across that sequence of plantings. The further you get across the paddock, the more impressive the activity of biological control agents becomes, and you get a huge advantage out of that balance as you go across the sequence of plantings. Now, pesticides in IPM, this is really a very important topic because it's the make it or break it in many ways for whether or not an IPM program is going to work. So the first rule, as I mentioned, is that we use them as a support tool and not the primary means of pest control in IPM. And we have to consider the impact of the pesticides on beneficials. So we don't just choose the most potent chemical product with the greatest efficacy against the pest necessarily, because that may be a chemical that's not really compatible with the key biological control agents. So this needing to know, is it safe to beneficials, is really critical. And it's not a very simple question to answer. With a lot of older chemical products, they were designed as broad spectrum insecticides, and we know that they're not safe to beneficials. But the newer selective chemistry is highly variable in terms of the impact on beneficials. And we do a lot of testing in our lab. This is my colleague Jessica Page. She's sitting there doing a bioassay, basically looking at beneficial insects and checking whether or not they're able to survive a pesticide application. So, as I said, lots of the old chemistry is pretty toxic, so we don't need to check what synthetic pyrethroids or good old Lawspan organophosphates, all of these older chemical groups. We don't really need to check what effect they're going to have on beneficials. We know for the most part they're going to be broad spectrum and highly toxic. With the newer selective chemistry, as I said, it's highly variable. So we have fantastic IPM products which are compatible with most vegetable production systems, and then in certain instances, for example, in hydroponic vegetables where we might rely heavily on predatory mites to control pest mites, we might steer clear of that product because the only things that it's toxic to are predatory mites, safe to everything else. So an example of exactly that situation would be a product like Movento. We recommend it regularly in outdoor vegetable crops where predatory mites are not the key group of biocontrol agents, but we would be very reluctant to recommend it in a protected or hydroponic, say, capsicum or cucumber crop. So we need to know, as I've just described there, we need to know which beneficial species we want to protect. If we're going to answer that question, is the chemical safe? We need to know safe to who. So the testing we do also has to consider both the acute and sublethal effects of pesticides. It's not just does it kill it on the first spray. It's, well, if this insect is exposed to a pesticide, can it still lay eggs? Does it manage to actually reproduce? Things like that. And we need to think about residual toxicity. Sometimes where we don't have a selective chemical, a soft IPM chemical as an option, then we're left looking at broad spectrum products, and we might want to choose the least residual products so that we can then reintroduce or allow for reinvasion of beneficials into the crop. And some fungicides are even toxic to beneficials. So this all sounds pretty complicated, and you might be wondering, how on earth do we get our head around this and put this into practice in a crop? I'll explain, and with some help from Nigel, give examples of how we do that in a moment. Just why do people actually use IPM? Usually adoption is driven by crisis, things like pesticides not working, so we get resistance. Pesticides are withdrawn from the market. We're going to see more and more of that in the future. We're already have seen some landmark decisions made in the last year. Things like neonicotinoid insecticides being banned for outdoor use in the European Union. We have, of course, issues with residues in produce. Using IPM sometimes is driven by the need to avoid that problem. Worker and environmental safety, all of these are reasons that people sometimes are faced by a crisis that drives them to wanting to use IPM. And in some instances, we induce pests when we use the wrong chemical product, and we also have a crisis. That presents another crisis. So we spray a broad spectrum insecticide and we kill the beneficials that were naturally controlling key pests, and suddenly we've ended up with a worse problem. All of these reasons drive people to use IPM, and we managed to make IPM work in some pretty difficult situations where people simply wouldn't believe that this approach is viable. So this is an example. My colleagues Paul and Jessica have been working in East Java with shallot growers over the last couple of years, and they were spraying between 90 and 150 insecticides in a 9-week period for a crop that's grown in 12 weeks. So that's very extreme, and they've been able to implement an IPM program now using between 2 and 7 soft sprays. so we can achieve some very exciting and dramatic results in situations where people really believe that the only answer was to increase the frequency of spraying and increase the rates of insecticides and increase just go as far as they could down the pesticide pathway. You might think that this is just something that happens overseas, but our Australian strawberry industry, certainly the Victorian and South Australian strawberry industries, faced a crisis that drove them to spraying on a daily basis, not too different to what the Indonesian shallot growers were doing, and they now use IPM successfully. We're seeing crises with resistance in brassicas 10 years ago, and now once again we're starting to see them. So as new chemicals are made available, and as those chemicals then get used up and we see resistance, this drives crisis, and we see people turning to IPM. So this example of the cabbage is not one that someone forgot to spray. It's been sprayed with 4 insecticides every week from transplant to harvest, and this is damage from diamondback moth. These growers now successfully use an IPM approach that's based on mostly sprays of BT sprays like Dipel and Centauri, and just the odd Group 28. So we've worked in so many different vegetable crops where different sets of options are applicable. This is an example of where it's not so much the sprays that are important, but taking out the sprays was the most important step. So with this leek grower, they were concerned about onion thrips and spraying on a weekly basis for onion thrips. Those sprays were killing basically all of the insects and mites in the crop, and they were flaring 2-spotted mite, which was resistant to the chemicals they were using. And without any predatory mites left to control them, they suddenly had thrips and mites in there, both resistant to chemicals. And this is the largest leek grower in Australia, I believe. They just simply stopped spraying on the advice of our little company many years ago. So this would have to be over 15 years ago. And instead of spraying, they just put some organic material, some mulch that you can see down the middle of the beds. And this helped boost populations of predatory mites and other small predatory species that live in the soil. They completely take care of the onion thrips, and the mite problem disappeared of its own accord as soon as predatory mites could re-establish naturally. So these are examples of where sometimes it isn't choosing an alternative spray, it's simply using a cultural control option that completely takes care of the pest. This farm simply doesn't spray for onion thrips or spray miticides for spider mites anymore at all. In a moment,
you're going to a question come in from Michael.
Yeah.
You were mentioning before the effect of pesticides on beneficials, and Michael's just asked, where can we find information about the toxicity of pesticides towards natural enemies?
So currently there are a couple of places you could go and probably get yourself reasonably confused, you could refer to some of the information put out by other industries like the cotton industry in Australia, or some rather outdated information on websites like goodbugs.org. But our company has a project currently funded by the vegetable industry to do a pretty comprehensive round of testing to look at the newer products that have been released, say in the last 10 to 12 years for the vegetable industry, and look at their impacts on beneficials. And that information is going to be made available to industry within the next year. So you're not going to have it for this season, but there'll be some little guidebooks made up and also available online. So that's probably something that, it's going to be a fantastic resource for the vegetable industry to have a way of ranking different pesticide products against each other for any given vegetable crop and the main beneficials that are important in that crop.
Excellent.
At the moment, your best bet is to give somebody like us a call and have a chat.
Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question, Michael. Thanks, Angelica.
That's all right. So this is just Adam Schreurs' celery farm, because you'll be hearing from him in a moment, and I believe he's not putting up any pictures of his farm. But when our company first started working with them, they were spraying twice a week for Heliothis that was resistant to the products they were using, and they also had problems with insecticide-resistant aphids vectoring virus in the celery. And they now, for coming up close to 20 years, have been implementing an IPM approach successfully. We recommend so few sprays on that farm. It's quite remarkable. So I gave you the horror stories of why people use IPM, but the upshot of it is that when we've got insecticide-resistant pests or some of the crises that I mentioned, using IPM becomes a way to get better pest control, to reduce our use of insecticides and improve market access if the pesticides that we've been using are an issue, for example, in export markets. And this huge advantage of simply reducing the reliance on sprays helps to delay the development of insecticide resistance. So rather than just relying on all the sprays we've got, we're relying on a robust set of complementary measures, biological, cultural controls, and then the few chemicals as we need them. And when we come to actually how do you get started, how do you work any of this out for yourself, the best way we find is to actually sit down and have a look at the pests, the key pests in the crop, list them, or all of the potential pests in the crop, and then start working out what sorts of beneficials are going to help to control them. And this information is not too difficult to access, or certainly with help from an IPM specialist or a trained agronomist like Nigel, who's going to talk in a moment. This information isn't too difficult to find, and the cultural controls are really something that we rely on the grower to tell us a lot about. We brainstorm with them about the sorts of things that they already do on farm that have an impact, positive or negative, on pest or beneficial populations. And then that specialist advice needs to come in to work out which chemicals can be used that are registered in that crop and that are going to be compatible with the key beneficials. And if there are no soft options, then how can we use broad spectrum products, the ones that are available, in the least disruptive way? So our approach over the years was probably, initially Paul and Jessica worked a lot directly with growers. Now we work still directly with growers, but much more we're actually training agronomists and advisors, because they then get the message out and can provide this service in an ongoing way, more widely than we can. So this is not from a vegetable crop, this is actually photobrassicas, but that's me showing a group of photobrassica agronomists in New Zealand how to pull apart caterpillars and check whether there are maggots inside, check whether they've been parasitized or not, and then teaching them how to go and look in the crop. And this is exactly what we've been doing also in South Australia with agronomists like Nigel in a pilot IPM training program that we've been running, funded by Hort Innovation, for the last almost 3 years. It's just about to wrap up. And Nigel's going to talk about that approach, working alongside advisors, giving them the training they need so that they can then provide ongoing IPM advice, services to growers in their region. That's it from me. Handing over, I think, to Nigel now.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Angelica. We've just had a question come in too about monitoring. obviously that you mentioned that was a key part of starting up an IPM strategy, is knowing what's out there in terms of pests and beneficials. Could you just provide a little bit more detail around what's involved in actually developing a monitoring strategy and what that looks like out on the ground?
So obviously it needs to fit in a commercial setting. You can't go and do a scientific study of every paddock every week, and that's really not what's necessary. I think in the first season, for whoever's doing the monitoring, just gaining confidence that they're actually able to find the things that they need to be able to find and identify them, means that in the first season the time spent learning how to do it might be, there's a bit of investment in that. But essentially we monitor crops quite quickly. If you imagine that it's a brassica crop, and we walk in, we check a couple of plants to see if we can find any aphids or any of the key caterpillar pests, we know quite quickly whether they're, if we find a few, we don't need to go and check further. We might simply check 10 plants and make an assessment of whether the pest is present, what stage it's at. Then we're always trying to look at trends over time rather than just thresholds, using numbers that, set threshold numbers. So we want to check the crop regularly over summer, definitely on a weekly basis. And then we're comparing what we see today to what we saw last week, and checking 10 to 20 plants may be more than enough. And we might check a young planting on the farm, a medium-sized planting, and a planting close to harvest. And looking at the same time, not just for the pest species, but for the signs of the predators or parasitoids. And checking if we've put a spray on, has it worked, those sorts of things. So it's always just comparing what we can see this week to what we saw last week. And that means that we're not left, if we leave the gap between monitoring too long, if we only checked after 2 weeks, we wouldn't quite feel so confident with a quick check. But doing it regularly and looking at trends over time is really the key.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Angelica. Nigel, I'm just going to hand over your screen to bring up your presentation. So hopefully that's come up at your end. Just while we're waiting for Nigel to bring up his screen, which we can now see, Trevor has provided some really good guidance on impact of pesticides on beneficials. So Murray Valley wine growers, and also DAF Queensland, some good guides there if you wanted to jump online and have a look. So thanks for that, Trevor. Nigel, over to you now to take us through the next part of the webinar.
Oh, thanks, Carl. Yeah, I'm Nigel Dolinek. I'm employed by Muir and Sons. I'm based in McLaren Vale, South Australia, about 50 kilometres south of Adelaide. I mainly work through the Mount Lofty Ranges or Adelaide Hills, and my main brassica crops are broccoli, broccolini, Brussels sprouts, lettuce, and I work with some hydroponic Asian vegetable growers as well. I'm just going to give an overview of the IPM project that I've been involved with for the last 2.5 years. We basically started out about 2.5 years ago with a bit of a group meeting amongst my fellow agronomists with Muir and Sons out on the Adelaide Plains. And it was a good opportunity for a group of people to come together with various backgrounds and experiences and just sit down and brainstorm, their experience. And what we were able to do was put together a matrix which basically outlined, the different pests that we all encountered, the chemicals that were available for our use, and then the predators associated with those insects, and then basically look at alternative strategies to undertake a more IPM friendly approach. And then we all sort of went away with a better understanding of sort of strategies on how to move forward. From there, with the help of Angelica and Paul, we then moved out into the field, and we had probably 3 or 4 good in-field sessions whereby we did a lot of pest identification, We always had the grower with us when possible, and farm managers. So we were able to glean as much information from the growers around past strategies, techniques, chemistry that the growers had used over the years. And then, you know, between the 3 or 4 of us, however many was in the field, we were able to sort of discuss new strategies and, you know, talk about the IPM approach. As Angelica mentioned, you know, it's not only a chemical approach. There's a cultural approach, and I guess more time spent out in the field with the grower and the manager of the farms, we were able to sort of get a real feel for our environment. And she touched on, you know, weeds, you know, harbouring pests into, for example, fat hen, you know, harbouring a lot of, you know, high numbers of thrips, and just get a real feel for the surrounding environment, and just how by, you know, managing those problem areas could greatly reduce the pressure that was on the crop. I guess as we were doing each of the infield sessions, we I guess developed our monitoring and scouting approach and technique. And I guess just Angelica covered off on this a minute ago, but I think one of the key things with scouting and monitoring is consistency, and, you know, trying to get back within the week. So you've got a real reference from sort of 6 or 7 days ago, which really helps with your decision making process. If you leave it for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, things can get out of control quite quickly. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a massive task. It can you know, be a 10-15 minute walk through a couple of different crops. Just to go back, that's our little group session there, which involved a lot of pest ID and a few laughs as well. I guess the other important thing with any sort of scouting and monitoring is good communication with your grower, and trying to get as much information back to the grower without overloading the grower with too much heavy detail. Communication is critical, and, you know, often decisions need to be made fairly quickly. So overcomplicating things can really hinder the process. In terms of challenges, I guess one of the things from an agronomist point of view is managing the expectations of the grower. Over the years, I think a lot of growers have sort of dipped their toe into this approach and have been burnt for one reason or another. This is not a silver bullet to eliminate, you know, chemical use. All growers have a slightly different risk threshold. You know, some growers are happy to sustain quite a bit of damage, and I mean that depends on what crop you're growing as well. For, you know, in Brussels sprouts, for example, they're a long-term crop in the ground. Damage early in the crop on a developing sprout can almost render it sort of unsaleable. So, you know, there always needs to be that caveat of, you know, okay, we've got a problem here, we need to revert back to traditional, you know, conventional chemistry or whatever needs to be done. BTs featured highly in our strategy, and I think that there'd also been a little bit of hesitation around BTs, and I think that had been due to a lack of education over the years, which was a main focus for us, to make sure that everyone who was using BTs was using them properly, and, you know, not using them first thing in the morning and having them exposed to UV throughout the day and degrading before they'd had a chance to work. So once we had all of our growers up to speed on how to maximise their BT usage, the results were really good, and everyone's using BTs at some stage throughout their crop. I guess one way of sort of overcoming the challenge of convincing people to go down this path was that even if a grower can eliminate one Group 28 insecticide application throughout the life of the crop, they're moving in the right direction. If they can eliminate 2 or 3, well, even better. But it's as long as the grower is moving in the right direction, the program's working well. I guess I've been lucky enough to have some students come out with me from Adelaide University, so that's given me an opportunity to sort of pass on some of my knowledge that I've learned through this program, and I guess it's developed confidence, which in turn has built my rapport with my growers and built our relationship, and I guess in turn that's been a real benefit for the business that I work for. In terms of IPM Technologies, who have run the program, their support has been outstanding. Their knowledge and accessibility has always been really good. I've spent a lot of time on the phone or texting Angelica from the field on a Wednesday afternoon whilst scouting around, and the information that's come back from those guys has been really good, and I've been able to sort of skill up other agronomists in our company as well, which has been really good. The guys at IPM Technologies, I don't know if you can see this, but have produced a small handbook, which has been a real benefit.
That's it.
I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, we can see that one.
It's a great little resource for agronomists and growers, and just your general staff out on the ground. I mean, the more eyes that are in the crop, the better. And all too often, people that haven't been trained to ID insects and predatory insects in the crop sort of refer to Google images, which there's thousands of images available, but it's surprising how often you can't find the one you're looking for. Whereas this guide has been developed for our environment, our crops, and it's a really, really handy tool. So I'd highly recommend to anyone who's sort of wanting to learn more about IPM and do their own scouting to get their hands on this book, which I'm sure Angelica can arrange. So that's basically the project in a nutshell. There's been the odd time when things have gone a little bit astray or pear-shaped. Numbers can escalate quickly, which is why scouting is just so critical. And the more people, like I said, the more people who can take a look at the crop, the better. Both of my Brussels sprout growers are releasing predatory wasps into their crops to control diamondback moth. So they've been working closely with the guys at Biological Services in Loxton, which has worked really well. And yeah, I think even the skeptics have really embraced this project, and yeah, it's been a real success.
It's fantastic. Thanks for that, Nigel. We just had a quick question from Bruce, just asking for the exact name of that guide that you were just referring to, just so people are aware.
It's called Pests and Beneficials of Brassica Vegetables. It's there information on the website, Angelica, or?
Not yet. It's not something we've actually put together with funding from any industry, and it's just something we've made ourselves so that when we work with people like Nigel, we can give them something so that when they ring on the phone, so I think I've found eggs of caterpillar X. We say, well, can you check page 9? And they go, oh no, sorry, it's the other one. Basically you'd have to just contact us at IPM Technologies. We can send you one. We don't have any formal way of distributing them.
That's good to know.
I've just put up another slide we're at a Brussels sprout grower's property here, Scott Samwell's, and he has planted a flower bed over the last couple of seasons, which is basically a mixture of, predominantly coriander, parsley, I think there was some basil in there as well, a couple of other herbs to generate a lot of flower. And that proved to be, quite an effective way of increasing, predatory insect numbers. So that's been a real success, a little trial there that I know he's gone ahead with it this season. I'd highly recommend anyone to have a look at that.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for that, Nish. So some really good lessons there around access to the right people at the right time and the right information. So we've got a couple more questions that have come through, but I'm conscious of time. I'd just like to hand over to Adam Schreurs now, who's going to take us through how best to use IPM in your farming system. So some practical tips and tools. So Adam, over to you.
Yeah, g'day. I'm Adam Schreurs. We're celery, leek, spinach and rocket growers in southeast Victoria, in the Cranbourne area, and now the Darwin area. So today I'm just going to speak a little bit about some of the challenges we had early on implementing IPM, how we manage it basically on a weekly basis now, and just put some practical examples behind a few of the things that Angelica and Nigel have been talking about. But I got into IPM about 18 years ago. Before there was too much of it around in vegetables at all. In fact, I think I was one of the first. But the main driver was resistance. We were getting a lot of damage from caterpillars and other insects. Back then we weren't even really sure what was doing most of our damage because we were using a broad spectrum insecticide weekly, just basically as a calendar spray to keep them clean. And we started seeing more and more damage over the years, and just decided there's got to be a better way of trying to control these. And I had heard of IPM Technologies. They were working for Smith's, the crisping company at the time, on a grower next door. So I approached Paul Horn, and he offered just to come over and have a bit of a look in our crops and see what he could see. And straight away, he saw there was basically no beneficials in there, and we had a lot of pest activity, which were obviously getting resistant because we were starting to apply more than one pesticide a week to try and control these things. So we basically felt we had nothing to lose to run a trial and implement IPM. We started with one of our properties. It was a property isolated on its own of 100 acres. Started there the first year, just really learning what our problems were, what bugs were mainly doing the damage, and what damage each pest was doing. There's quite a few different caterpillars out there. We get like a cutworm caterpillar. It only damages the top outer leaves of our celery crop, for instance. So that's a caterpillar we don't particularly place a lot of importance on getting rid of because they they might only damage outer leaves, not the inner heart. Whereas something like a Heliothis armigera, it will go directly to the heart and start chewing the stems out. So for us, it was understanding which pest was doing what damage to the plant, and then targeting those pests individually with soft sprays that would target, say, Heliothis and leave our beneficial pests alone. So it was probably about 2 years of learning what the thresholds were of, how many caterpillars we could put up with versus how many beneficials we had in our crop without resulting in too much damage. Early on, there were some times where we did put a few harder sprays out because of, I suppose, basically just itchy feet and getting worried that the crop was getting too much damage, and probably sometimes against the will of Paul Horn and his IPM approach. But over time, we sort of saw the results and learnt to trust in the approach that he was taking, and watching the beneficials do their job, eating up eggs, taking out aphids. And, after that 2 years, we decided that we could roll out IPM through all of our properties. And it basically starts now. We plant empty fields. Initially, as Angelica was saying, there's a lot of different cultural controls that help, and one of the biggest is to not have weeds around, have a very clean paddock to start with. So we always make sure the paddock starts clean, and because of that, we don't have a lot of beneficials in the crop initially. So the first few weeks we plant transplanted plants, so it's a very vulnerable time for the plants in the first 4 weeks. So we have to watch them very carefully, waiting for our beneficial numbers to build up, which they do, and it generally only takes around 4 weeks or so to get those natural beneficials in the crop. And from there on, it's really just knowing what's in there and monitoring on a very regular basis. We have an entomologist, or Paul Horn and Angelica and Jesse, come in weekly. They check through our crops. They'll just check representative areas throughout the paddock, areas that we know are fairly representative of a planting size. So they might do 5 or 6 different areas through the paddock. They will use like a vacuum cleaner with a sock on it, and suck probably 100 plants clean of all the bugs that are in there. They're tipped out in a tray, and we just sit there and count the beneficials versus aphids or bad bugs, and just get an understanding of what's in there. And a lot of the time, if we see, there's a lot of lacewings and predatory wasps, and there might be a few aphids in there, but we don't even bother with the aphids because we know the beneficials will clean them up. For the caterpillars, we also use pheromone traps, which they provide the pheromone and put out in the field as the crops grow. And that just gives us an idea of when our main pest is Heliothis for celery. So we can check those on a fairly regular basis, and it gives us an idea of when the moth flights come into the farm. We can open the traps and count the number of moths in the trap, and depending on how many are in there, we know, say there's more than 50 or 60 moths, we know we're probably going to have a bit of an issue with Heliothis throughout the crop. So we know how long it takes them to hatch after they've been laid. So we start monitoring them, even on a daily basis to see when those eggs do hatch, so we can time our BT sprays. So as we're targeting a freshly hatched caterpillar rather than something that's grown too big, and it's going to be difficult for the sprays to eliminate the problem. The other thing that we did initially when we started was keep records of our moth counts and records of our beneficials and when we had aphid flights, and we did that for probably the first 8 or 9 years. We still do to a point, but we have found that the timing of the moth flights and other problems that we have are almost identical year on year to a point where we can overlay our graphs on top of each other and they're the same basically. Other problems we have are red-legged earth mite, things like that come in from outside our boundaries, which a lot of the time are out of our control. So we do spray through the vulnerable times of year for red-legged mite, things like that. We do spray border sprays, which means just putting a boundary of like a ring of chemical around the property, and it just stops those insects walking in from neighbouring properties and getting into our crops without having to physically put any chemical over our crops. There are times that we have had to. We've had a few mite infestations over the years because we are only targeting mainly Heliotis and the direct pests that are doing the damage. We have found that there are so many other, now that we're not wiping everything out with broad spectrum sprays, there's so many other pests that we actually didn't know were doing damage. So there's a whole lot of other cultural controls we've had to put into place to stop them getting into our crop. From time to time, we've even sprayed at the outside of the actual crop. It might be only the outside 50 metres of the whole crop, but it still allows the rest of the beneficials in the property to survive and keep working for us against some of the badder bugs.
Adam, I've just got a quick question coming from Tony. He was just wondering, for the area of crops that you've planted, how much time are you spending scouting each week when pest pressure is the highest?
Look, I have Paul and Jesse and Angelica come in weekly. They would spend probably, I'd say, around 5 hours a week on our property. But what they do is really just a guide for myself, and it's up to myself and my people to continue those inspections through the week. So, we might. I don't put it all down to IPM. I check all my crops daily. So, and that might be just for weeds or anything else that's going on. But so it's daily. I'd probably spend 3 to 4 hours every day walking crops. But there's a lot of travel time in between those crops.
Yeah, Adam, you might want to explain how large your farm is. That might horrify some smaller growers. You might just mention how big your operation is.
Yeah, we grow around 500 hectares of celery, probably 200 of leeks, and another few hundred of spinach and rocket. So it is a very large farm, and most monitoring points cover around 100 acres, 150 acres, thereabouts. We'll pick a central position for 100 acres, so it's not a huge amount of time for the amount of crop that we do have.
And Adam, you mentioned before just some of the challenges you had I guess, needing to spray sometimes to the detriment of beneficials. I'm just interested to get Angelica or Nigel, your opinion on that too, and how you've dealt with that with other growers, because it is a common concern.
Yeah, so I guess it very much depends on things like the length of the crop cycle. So you know, that there are extremes, like in celery, it's the summer crops in and out in 12 weeks. That sort of it sits in the middle. But with a leafy veg crop, it's only a couple of weeks, and then Nigel's got these Brussels sprouts in the ground for you know, half a year. So depending on, you know, the length of the crop, time to harvest, whether you've got time for beneficials to then reinvade after that spray. Sometimes if we know that we're going to need a broad spectrum spray, we either target it right at the beginning, if possible, to allow the residue to then disappear and beneficials to move in, or we try and use it right towards the very end when the beneficials have done their job already and there isn't time to flare other pests. So it's tricky to answer that in a general sense, but maybe that just gives you some idea of how we sometimes we just don't have an option. So there are pests like Rutherglen bugs that fly in really, you know, large numbers, and there's no biological control agent that takes care of them quickly enough. And so we resort to using broad spectrum insecticides over the crop very shortly before harvest. And we still call that part of IPM. It's an adaptive system. It's no longer IPM just because we had to spray a synthetic pyrethroid. It's our last option, but we still can resort to that, and it's still very much, you know, within the scope of what we do.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Nigel, did you have anything? Oh, sorry, Adam.
Sorry, Carl. Just on that, you know, we're at a point now where pretty well all of our winter crops get no insecticides at all now. The leeks, we wouldn't have sprayed leeks with an insecticide for 18 years since the day we took it on. And celery, it would be rare to get an insecticide through winter. If it is, it may be an aphid spray, and that a Movento, which is quite soft on the beneficials, but still a rare occasion. And summer, you know, we might be down to say 2 or 3, maybe 4 BT sprays, and possibly 1 Group 28, and that's fairly rare too.
So, Adam, did you have anything that you wanted to finish up on before we bring the session to a close? I'm just conscious of time. Yep.
No, well, other than to say, it's something that has to be persisted with. You're going to see a bit of damage early on, and you just have to persist and see past the damage, because when it's first implemented, you are going to see a bit. But I think there's a lot more knowledge out these days with IPM Technologies and the knowledge they're passing on to other agronomists that we probably did it the hard way back then. We were all learning what was what and what was going to damage our crops. But I think it should be a much easier path these days with all the knowledge that's there and knowing the thresholds of what beneficials you need in there and the chemistry that's out there as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point to end on there. So thanks for that, Adam. Just a quick one too. You mentioned there was quite a lot of trial work early on, over 2 years. I'm just interested on what that final hurdle was or driver to implement across all your farms in the end.
Okay, so we got to a point where I think I mentioned just before that we still did see a fair bit of damage. Like, our damage is horrendous from the resistance problems we had initially, but then we implemented the IPM. Probably didn't see a huge improvement the first year. We were still seeing damage, but we were still learning on what was doing the damage and what we had to target. But we got to a point after those 2 years that the crop was clean. We had very, very little damage. We used very little insecticide, and that was the sealer that we thought we could roll it out. I mean, I did have fathers and uncles as part of the business that were very sceptical at the time, so it took a bit of getting past them to roll it out. But I mean, they're all very much on board now, and you know, I don't think we could do it any other way now.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thanks, Adam. And also a big thanks to Angelica and Nigel for their presentations and sharing some of their insight and experiences. I really appreciate that. These sessions don't happen without the generous time donation of the presenters, so thank you very much. We have gone slightly over time, but I didn't want to clip that discussion short because it was really worthwhile, I think. Just in finishing up, there was a few questions we didn't get to, which we'll take offline and endeavour to answer on email. So apologies if you're one of the questions we didn't quite have time for, but we'll get back to you. There's also some handouts in the side control panel there that I've just popped up since we started. A few of the resources that Trevor's suggested, but also some from the Integrated Crop Protection Project, just around basics of protecting your crop, managing some chewing and biting insects, and also some more info on pesticide resistance. If you hadn't joined one of those sessions before, there was 3 other webinars in the series which are up on your screen now if you're interested in accessing the recordings of those. But look, thank you very much for your time today and joining, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.